name is Evelyn Blanco. I'm an HR advisor with Outlook HR. And today we are lucky and excited to welcome Robert Huddock as our guest speaker as we discuss returning to the workplace after COVID. Robert is from Huddock Employment Law Group. He is a deeply experienced litigator with over 20 years of practice in the field of employment law. He's highly rated by Martindale-Hubbell and has devoted his career to employment law for businesses for the last 15 years. He spent several years in big law and has experience managing large litigation teams. Rob was drawn to the human side of employment law, helping clients overcome challenges presented by difficult issues and sparing them the angst of conflict and worry. And we're so thankful that you're joining us today, Rob. To let you guys know, we are going to be handling today's webinar as a discussion. We have several questions and that are very hot and prevalent in today's ever-changing environment. And Robert is here to help us navigate this and answer these burning questions that we all have. Your questions are welcome. Please feel free to place them in the chat box. Also, there will be a survey at the end, so we appreciate for you that you stay and participate. So with that said, let's go ahead and just jump in. So today we're going to be covering employers requiring vaccinations for COVID-19, screening and testing, as well as face coverings and social distancing, and finally remote work, which many employers are now not only allowing, but considering permanently, if not already going permanent. So here we go. So Robert, as you know, everybody, I've heard this from many of my clients, friends socially, and the big hot topic is, can employers require employees to be vaccinated? What's the deal? What is actually going on with this?
The short answer is yes. And what we've done in the slides is we have some more detailed information about what we're going to talk about today. In our discussion, we are going to focus on the things you really need to know. And again, the short answer is yes. And in the slides, we have a bunch of information about the sources, each of the sources of the having the requirement. But I think that particularly now, because so many municipalities, private employers, and others have already adapted vaccine mandates, it is pretty well established that vaccine requirements are allowed. The more of the question and more of the debate, I guess you'd say, is over how to apply them and interpretation of some of the exceptions and things like that. So now I think that the important end here and the more important rules are that if you have if you choose to have a vaccination requirement, and we're going to be talking about practical considerations for considering whether you want to have a vaccine requirement, but if you have one, again, you can legally require it. The scenario which is going to be most important is when you have a customer or client-facing business, or you have people work in close quarters.
Got it.
So I think that it would always be easy to justify in those situations. There may be when I say justify, I don't mean legally. I mean perhaps with your employees and workers who may have some reservations about a vaccine requirement. But if you are an employer that does not have a employer-provided workplace, or there's a situation where employees have no contact with each other, or there's no contact with clients or customers, then you'd have a more difficult time getting acceptance among those who may have reservations.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, for those of us, for example, if you're working remotely on a permanent basis, the company really is not justified in having a vaccination requirement.
No, because there's just no risk of having that employee be exposed to anyone else who might transmit the virus in the course and scope of work. And whatever that person does personally is not something that is going to be associated with the employer. One thing I did want to add, if you do have let me back up. There's both the vaccination requirement, and these are interrelated, and we'll get into this more later. There's the vaccination requirement, actually having to receive the vaccine, and then there is the issue of reporting of vaccination status. And employers can require reporting of vaccination status, but they must do so without receiving medical information. And also, you must keep the status, either vaccinated or unvaccinated, that information confidential. That doesn't mean you can't share it among management and perhaps supervisors on a need-to-know basis, but otherwise it needs to be kept confidential from others in the workplace.
So we've got a couple of questions, and they're sort of timely, so I want to address them. So one is, let me go through that. I'm not sure if you plan to, so since the vaccine is still considered experimental, people are required to sign a document saying they are aware it's experimental and they waive any rights to sue the manufacturer if anything goes wrong. Given that, how can the vaccine legally be made mandatory by companies and or local governments when someone has to sign away their rights to be compensated if they are injured by the vaccine? Once it gets full approval, I get being allowed to mandate it. So basically they're saying, how can we mandate something that is not completely, that is experimental?
Well, that is the argument that some folks who have reservations about vaccine are making. And there are some people, some companies who have chosen to have that vaccination requirement on hold until it gets final approval. But it is allowed on now for emergency rules. Many people have already implemented that requirement. And the issue of why you can do it when it's just emergency is kind of a philosophical debate, or a debate that has to do with the vaccination rather than, employment issues.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, at the end of the day, because of the current situation with COVID, we are allowed to require it regardless, to require to have a vaccination requirement policy because of the current situation with COVID.
Yes, in my strong opinion, you can, and that's based on both the positions that the government entities who are responsible for taking such positions, and also on how it's been put into practice, and also how it's been successfully defended in at least one lawsuit.
Got it. The next one we have regarding vaccination is I read only FDA approved vaccinations are allowed to be required by employees. Is that incorrect? It would sound like it is incorrect in this emergency situation.
Yeah, so when you talk about FDA approved, you talk about emergency approval versus final approval.
Got it.
And when you hear the statement only FDA approved, and that's the whole debate. That's what, let me just say this. There's been a handful of lawsuits, and we'll get into more of that later. But in the lawsuits, the argument by the plaintiffs is the same. And that is that with emergency approval rather than final approval, it amounts to human experimentation, which has been banned by the Nuremberg principles back from World War II
Wow.
and the Nazis doing human experimentation. And at least one court has completely rejected that view. And so as we just discussed, I think it is very clear that regardless of whatever the moral or personal rights debate is, can be done. I think, did I answer that question completely?
That it can be required, regardless of.
Emergency versus final. Yeah.
Yes, you did.
And let me add something.
Okay.
There's government agencies who are who have legal vaccination requirements, who base it on emergency approval. So that's kind of a further support of the fact that you can do it, irrespective of whether, that's something that should or shouldn't be done. Right.
Then I've got three different participants asking, if you are having a vaccination policy, can an employer ask for proof or to actually see the vaccination card, or is it an honor system?
Okay, very good question. I've spent some time over the last couple of weeks actually drafting vaccination policies for some of my clients. And reporting is a necessary element of a vaccination requirement, because you've got probably quite a few people who have already received the vaccination. And so what you have to do for those folks is you have to get sufficient proof of the fact that they've been vaccinated. And what you can look at as guidance for what constitutes sufficient proof and things you might want to stay away from in terms of requiring proof is the recent order by the California Department of Public Health with respect to healthcare workers. In that order, they've listed out, it's either 5 or 6 different things that can serve as that are sufficient and appropriate, in their opinion, as to what you can require as proof. So, for example, it's vaccination cards, it's a certain designation by a healthcare provider, it's the QR code system that California has come up with, and there's different things that there's more specifics to that, and we can go through them if.
No, I don't think it's necessary. But I just want to make sure we're clear. So an employer, non-healthcare, can ask to see the vaccination card. That's legal. Yes, and there's, for example, healthcare workers, that order makes it a requirement. Okay. We have another question. It says, which I believe the answer is no. If vaccine is required by the employer, wouldn't workers' compensation cover any side effects?
I'm not a workers' compensation attorney, or have really any knowledge of it to be able to comfortably answer that question. Okay. I would lean towards no, but I don't know that for a fact. So that's something you want to check with your workers' compensation carrier. And can an employer take a copy of the vaccination card? I would say yes. Is that correct, Robert? That's a very good question, because you can't. You cannot. Right. I'm glad you can look at the vaccination card and document that I saw the vaccination card, and therefore they are established as being vaccinated, but you can't keep the vaccination card, and you need to keep the documentation of the status and the fact of the status confidential, as was just discussed a few minutes ago. Got it. Okay, great. So I know that you're going to address this, but one of the questions is jumping us to that. It says, can an employee claim religious exemption for both vaccination and testing? And here's the key. What kind of proof does an employer need to see? As far as testing, I'm unaware of any. I have not seen among all the different, digging into this that I've
Right.
done where there was ever a religious exception requested or claimed with respect to testing. With respect to vaccination, I haven't heard of an actual example. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that it is an exception and
Right.
what are some points of analysis that you need to do. Or actually, I take that back. I believe there is and I don't know if it's universal or not, but my understanding is that at least some people who are Jehovah's Witnesses have some kind of,
Right. Something of the religion prohibits them from taking vaccinations.
Resistance. But we will talk about what happens in such a situation later.
Okay. Because this particular participant is saying they have an employee claiming both that their religious belief prohibits them from the vaccination and the testing.
Well, great. If that same person who asked the question can write in what they're claiming, we can use that as an example to walk through the analysis of religious exemption.
Okay, I'm asking them to elaborate right now. In the meantime, we have another question that says, if you take your child to get vaccinated and he or she gets symptoms, can we get supplemental sick leave for the days we take care of your child? I believe that's yes.
And you can, well, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And if you need to know more, then I can elaborate.
Okay. All right, well, let's go ahead and go on. I'm waiting for that particular participant to elaborate on the employee that's claiming religious. In the meantime, let's go ahead. So did you want to continue with this or should we move on?
No. I think we're moving on to exactly those exceptions.
Oh, okay. So she gave us a letter from her pastor and a letter that she wrote. That employee that's claiming the vaccination and religious belief. So, I mean, I would, it's a great question. I actually had it posed to me as well. I had an employee that said to me, well, I'm not religious, but I'm a very spiritual and I'm strongly against taking this vaccination. And I was quite honestly at a bit of a loss because, and we're going to talk about this, I know, but, like sincerely held religious belief, what does that mean? And who gets to define that?
Let's discuss it. I think a good place to start is to discuss the fundamental points of analysis as to both disability or medical condition, the one exception, and sincerely held religious belief, the other exception. Right. With respect to the exception that's based on disability, it's more accurately considered as a medical condition issue, meaning does that person have a medical condition which renders them ineligible to get the vaccine? So for example, if there is someone who has a medical condition which poses an unreasonable risk on them of getting serious illness or somehow affecting that underlying condition, then that's something that's probably going to qualify for that exemption. Okay. And then, of course, as with any disability claims, you have to initiate the interactive process, identify whether there's a reasonable accommodation. If there is a reasonable accommodation identified, then and it's going to be something difficult to do under your circumstances, then there are exceptions for undue hardship and also for health and safety of your other employees that are in your workplace.
Got it. Okay.
Those, let me just add, those are hard to establish. They're narrow. But
I would imagine, yeah.
So let's get on to sincerely held religious belief.
Okay, I have, sorry to interrupt you, Robert, I apologize, but sure. I do have more information from the particular participant. She says that, I think that she's basically copied the letter here, but it says, as an ordained pastor and head of True Hope Ministry, I am writing to affirm such and such person sincerely held religious objection to COVID test and vaccine for the purpose of seeking a religious exemption. The organization receiving the request may only make a reasonable inquiry to the sincerity of the individual's claim. This letter provides above and beyond what is required or expected in seeking a religious exemption. According to Title VII of the Civil Rights Law, religious beliefs must be accommodated. Please note that every believer is a member of the body of Christ, regardless of one's geographic region. The individual for whom I am providing this letter of attestation does not have to prove any attendance in any particular church, length of time, or religious conviction, nor does one's sincerely held religious belief have to be aligned with any formal religion according to state and federal laws. Again, the federal law protects each individual's right to one's religious and or sincere. That's it.
Yeah. I wonder where that pastor went to law school.
Yeah.
Because that is clearly written by a lawyer. And at most, to me anyway, it sounds like this particular person had a lawyer write a letter and then, take that letter to the pastor and sign it. So let's talk about that.
Okay.
In California, the definition of religion for purpose of a sincerely held religious belief, whether it's for vaccination or otherwise or other purposes, is this. It's a 3-point analysis, or 3 points that must be present for it to be considered a religion for this purpose. And that is, it addresses questions having to do with deep and imponderable matters. It is comprehensive, a belief system as opposed to an isolated teaching. Number 3, it can be recognized by the presence of certain formal and external signs. Now, the definition is broad, and it need not be a formal or well-recognized religion. So, for example, of course, if you have Jehovah's Witnesses, that's something that's going to be easily establishable as a religion. But there's other things that you can get into when someone's claiming a religion. I just have 2 examples in cases that are actually decided in California. And for one of them, and this is not necessarily in the vaccine, and it's not in the vaccine area, but it's, like I said, it's still an analysis of religion, which is the same, which would be the same for if it was a vaccination situation. So there was one case where somebody claimed that they were a vegan, and that did not, that whatever was the requirement, they were saying, well, my belief with respect to veganism is that I can't do X, Y, or Z. And that just didn't qualify, because if you think about those 3 factors that are considered, it doesn't really fit. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be something, really formal or anything that you've even heard of before. So, for example, one case, the employee in question said that he had, his belief was worship of the sun god Ra, the one, that you may have heard, an Egyptian or what have you. And that was found to be sufficient. So now, actually, let me back up. In the example that's been presented by one of the attendees, even with all that language, they were not really saying anything about the facts. They were just reciting law, right, in an abstract. And so, to me, and I'm not sure that I picked it all up, but it doesn't sound like they actually addressed. They may have at least indirectly addressed one of or more of those factors, but I really didn't hear. I really didn't hear that much about the factors.
Okay. I was thinking the same thing.
Also, the pastor / attorney who wrote that letter did reference the fact that I think so, that you can require evidence when you can, when it's reasonable. Again, that's completely vague and open to interpretation, but you can require evidence from the person who's claiming it. And I think in this case is a prime example, in my opinion. And so for some examples of what would be evidence: written material describing the religion, the employee's description of the religion, or statements of witnesses who observed the employee either observing those religious principles or specifically not observing them. Now, here's an important point with respect to exactly that example, and that is to qualify for the sincerely held religious belief, the employee must show a specific conflict between the subject requirement, in here vaccine, and the religious belief or practice. I heard none of that.
Right, agreed.
What is in
the conflict, right?
Of the whatever the named religion was, which is against vaccine, and how exactly do those conflict?
Right. Okay. Thank you. That was a good explanation. One of our participants has asked that you please repeat the 3 factors required to for the sincerely held religious belief to be met. Yes.
So a qualifying religion has the following characteristics. That is, it addresses questions having to do with deep and imponderable matters. Second, it is comprehensive. It is a belief system as opposed to an isolated teaching. And then it can be recognized by the presence of certain formal and external signs.
Great. Thank you so much for doing that, Robert. We have a couple more questions that are related to this. What do you do if an employee refuses to fill out a self-certification vaccination form? They're trying to stay compliant and have an employee who's refusing to fill out the form, even though there's an option to decline to state. I would say that 2 managers sign it and say the employee refuses to sign it. And that's what that's what you do generally in these situations. But I'm wondering, as I think out loud, would this be cause for a disciplinary action?
Yes. So given the reporting requirements, in that situation, an employer must treat that person as unvaccinated.
Right. Because
if you can't get, and this is at least somewhat specific in terms of the requirement. And so, you for all purposes, if you can't get substantial or sufficient proof of vaccination, such as if they refuse, then that person needs to be treated as unvaccinated. If you have a vaccination requirement, and that requirement, it's inherent in the requirement, I suppose, but irrespective of that, that can be part of, you can state that specifically in your policy, then that's just as if the person is unvaccinated and says, I'm not going to be vaccinated.
Right.
And so it would be subject to whatever you decide as an employer is the consequence of that.
Okay. Okay. And then we have one more question, and I think we need to move on because we're at 1:30. So it says, I understand the vaccination status needs to be kept confidential, but we are requiring weekly testing if someone cannot attest that they have been vaccinated. Isn't it obvious to others that someone who has tests weekly has not been vaccinated? So does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And I wonder, how does one coworker know that
the other coworker is being tested? Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It sounds to me like this particular company is not doing the testing in a very confidential manner if the other employees are seeing them get tested. So I'm guessing that the best advice we could give this particular person is they need to try to do the testing in a more private and confidential manner so that everybody doesn't see that it's happening. Would you agree?
Yes.
All right. Okay. If you have 200 plus employees, oh, okay. Yes. They have to go in groups. That makes sense. All right.
Yeah. I mean, if it's not, it's going to be subject to a rule of reason. So
right.
if you've got a situation like, and I'm sure there's a lot of circumstances that warrant you doing it in groups or what have you,
right.
That's not going to be something where you haven't met your requirement to keep it confidential.
Right. Makes sense. Okay. So we discussed this. So bottom line, the two exceptions for the vaccine exemption are if a medical disability and or a sincerely held religious belief that meet the required factors that you outlined to us.
Yes, and I guess as a practical matter, I would say err on the side of giving a request or to interpret whatever the religion is being claimed and the details around it. Treat it broadly, but that's not to say, you have to just strike a balance between, treating it broadly so that you don't have to face a potential problem with it,
right.
But also that you exercise your rights. And that example that's been given is a good example.
Yeah.
That's not something that you would be expected to say, oh, you're giving him a hard time. What they didn't provide is the basics of what makes it qualify as a religion and what makes it qualify as something that I don't want to say excuses, but leads to them not being required to be vaccinated as part of the vaccination program. And then also, like I just alluded to, the consideration can be just like any other employment claim, really, and that let me think about this situation in not only in terms of what I have a right to do, but also how likely is this to lead to a claim, and that might depend upon the individual, perhaps. I mean, you do have to technically apply it equally among all people, but
right.
That you can still consider that in your analysis of whether or not the exception is something you want to provide. Because look, if they file a claim, that's going to be, money spent regardless of whether you prove your position, I guess is the
right. So it's a little bit of choose your battles carefully, right?
Yeah. And like I said, it's just like any other employment claim.
Yep. Okay. We have one more question on the vaccination. So Robert mentioned we cannot keep a copy of the vaccination card. This participant read that the vaccination card itself is not a medical record, and as long as there is not any medical history, information, or diagnosis attached to the card, that it is legal to keep a copy of the card. Is this untrue?
It is legal to keep. Well, yes, it's untrue. We're going with a lot of different negatives.
The bottom line, you cannot make a copy.
The bottom line is you can't keep a copy of the vaccination card. And I think again, that order that applies to healthcare workers is specific to healthcare workers. And I think in there, it states that you can't keep a copy of the vaccination card, but either if it doesn't, or, otherwise, there's other sources that indicate specifically that you can.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So moving on. So when mandating a vaccine and having a vaccine requirement policy, what wage and hour considerations does an employer need to take into consideration?
Yeah. And so we'll keep this as simple as possible so we can keep on time here. Basically, yes. And you have to think in terms of time and cost. Hours, and the time is hours worked. Cost is reimbursement of work-related expenses. So if you as an employer have a requirement for vaccination and that person needs to, for whatever reason, get that vaccination outside of otherwise regularly scheduled time, then that needs to be paid for. That time needs to be paid for. Also, it can't take place during a meal break or rest break to which that particular employee may be entitled.
Okay.
And also, with respect to that time, in connection with getting the vaccine must be treated just like any other time. More specifically, if that results in overtime, if that's more than 8 hours a day or what have you, then that's overtime pay.
Okay, great.
And also that time includes any travel time that is necessary to get that vaccine. Now, some employers are making the vaccine available at their workplace. And so if that person was to get that vaccine at their workplace and it was possible for them to get it during work hours, then you're not going to have that issue. So let's go on to expense. If you have a vaccine requirement, whether it's at work or otherwise, I doubt there'd be a cost at work, but, and then also you can make part of your program that, if you're not offering it, that they go to a no cost provider of administering vaccinations. So that, would take that situation, or that would be a situation in where cost or reimbursement wouldn't have to be a consideration. But if whatever the circumstances are, there's a cost to getting the vaccination, then that's something the employer is responsible for reimbursing. And let me give an example. Let's say you have an employee who says, you know what, I don't really trust and let's just say the person, the company has someone come in and provide the vaccine. And they say, you know what, I don't really trust this, provider of a vaccine. I'd really be more comfortable going to my doctor and getting it through him or her. Well, that's a judgment call. You could say to yourself, well, whatever the time and the expense isn't going to be that great. So maybe we let them do that. But then there's also the consideration of, if I let this person do it and 50 other people want to do it, then it gets out of hand. But the bottom line there is you don't have to let them get it through their doctor. You can require that they either get it through any employer that has a provider within the workplace or a no-cost provider.
Okay. All right. So,
one more thing.
Uh-huh.
In the instance that you have a vaccination requirement and the person has to travel wherever to get it, an employer is responsible for reimbursing any travel costs
mileage
associated with that.
Okay. All right. So bottom line, you do have to pay them for the time that they are, that it takes for them to take the vaccine. Any expenses incurred should be reimbursed. And
bottom line stated generally, absolutely.
And if they incur overtime, it goes over their 8-hour day, you have to apply the overtime rate.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So let's move on. This is all the backup that we have. I think we've talked a lot about this, but there's some practical things to consider in connection with deciding if you want to have a vaccine requirement, and also what are some of the costs and benefits of vaccination requirements. We've talked about this, we've alluded to it, but I don't know if you want to dig deeper into this.
Maybe. I mean, I think that someone who's on the fence about a vaccine requirement may find this useful.
Okay.
And, these are just things that I've come up with as to, given all considerations in connection with a vaccine requirement, things you might want to consider in deciding whether you want to have a vaccine requirement, because that's what some employers are doing. They say, I don't want to deal with all this. I'd like to have one, but I'm choosing not to have one. So here they are. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of upsides and potential downsides. This is not everything, of course. Some of them are, employer specific, but let me just offer these as things you might want to consider. So let's talk about the potential upsides to a vaccination requirement. One is that's going to that is going to be strong proof that the employer is meeting its duty to provide, and this is a general duty, safe and healthy workplace for all its employees. Secondly, it could decrease workers' compensation exposure and liability. Also, it potentially decreases extended absences due to people contracting COVID. And let's say one of your key employees gets COVID, that's going to be a problem. And you can, lower the risk of that with a vaccination requirement. Or if there's an outbreak among people who are unvaccinated, that clearly will cause a problem with operations. Also, for a client and customer facing business, it will, for those folks who are very particular about vaccination, your clients and your customers, you having a vaccination requirement will provide them comfort. In fact, I represent a skilled nursing facility, and even before the whole thing of vaccination requirement come up, they were flooded with calls about what percentage of your workers are vaccinated, because they had concerns about people being their workers being unvaccinated. So those are some of the upsides. What are some of the downsides? Well, there is, regardless of what the viability of the argument that is made as to the impropriety of a vaccine requirement, it does set up potential legal exposure, facing a claim. You could probably defend it if you do everything right, but there's cost to facing a claim. We talked about that a little bit before. Yeah. And a large number, let me strike that. Well, if you have a vaccine requirement and someone just adamantly refuses to get the vaccine, and there's a large number of people, and the consequences of that is, well, you need to come into the workplace. You can't come into the workplace under the vaccine requirement. So therefore, we have to terminate your employment. Well, if you have a large number of people that do that, that's a problem.
Right.
And if you have a key employee that individually says, I refuse to be vaccinated, again, for obvious reasons, that would be a problem.
Right.
Then also a major one is the dealing with, as we can see in this religious belief example, dealing with it can be take away time and have an administrative cost for dealing with and deciding these.
Right, lack of productivity, addressing this can be a time suck, for lack of a better phrase. Okay, so we're going to move on to the face coverings, because I know that this is a hot topic as well, and we're running low on time. So, oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay. So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So, face coverings and physical distancing rules have changed. They change every day. We know that in Los Angeles, they're back up. And have there been any changes as a result of the vaccine? And what are the current rules regarding face coverings and social distancing in the workplace? And we already have a question on this topic from earlier. But let's go ahead and address the topic, and then we'll look at the question that we have.
I think this is important in this respect. Some employers are having a vaccination requirement where it's more of a choice rather than a requirement, meaning either be vaccinated or be subject to testing.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
You can require more than that. And California has spoken specifically on this in the recent order for healthcare workers. And that is, you either get the requirement or you meet for an exception of one of those two exceptions. And in that instance, you do testing. It's not a blanket choice, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Does that make sense to you, Evelyn?
Well, so what I'm hearing you say is, I have a vaccination policy. And if you meet one of the two exceptions, which is medical or religious belief, then you do the testing. But it's not testing or vaccination.
That
You have to
pretty
meet.
much sums it up.
Okay.
And so I introduced that here because we not only talk for those people, and let's just take somebody who met for an exemption. It's not just testing, but they're going to be subject to the masking and, as of now, just the masking requirement.
Right.
And also, irrespective of a vaccination requirement, as a technical matter, you could require masking in the workplace. So let's just talk about that. In terms of physical distancing, that requirement was removed when California reopened its economy back on, was it June 15th? Yeah.
June 15th, yeah.
Or July 15th? I
think it was June. I think it was June.
Anyway, there are, however, limited circumstances in which it might be required, physical distancing, and that is during an outbreak, there's a specific definition to outbreak. An employer must evaluate whether distancing is required to control the outbreak, and if so, enforce it. And then also during a major outbreak, also with a definition, and you must have distancing in that regardless of vaccination status. Face covering. For fully vaccinated folks, they do not necessarily need to wear face coverings indoors, except during outbreaks. But that doesn't mean that you can't require it as an employer. That's just permissive, saying, hey, you can permit that if you want to, but in your private workplace, you can say that we are mandating face coverings.
Which is a great segue into one of the questions we have.
Great.
And it says, can you legally terminate an employee for not complying with mask rules? They have an employee who refuses to wear a mask. And I would say, if it's a condition of your employment to wear a mask, yes, you can terminate.
Yeah, think about it in these terms. It's all about setting rules for your workplace. And as long as those rules aren't discriminatory based on a protected category, then it's going to be something you can do. And it's same with the vax and same with the mask. If you say, as a condition of employment, you need to be vaxxed, and they don't, then you have the right as an employer to say, well, you can't. Now, let me also say this. It probably would behoove you to consider alternatives to termination when you have that situation when you have a vaccination requirement. Possible alternatives: can that person do remote work? Is there a segregated place where they can spend their entire day in the workplace? But again, you have the slippery slope of everybody or saying this person could do it, but I couldn't. You all know, right. You probably all know the drill there. Yeah. But again, a mask requirement is just like a vax requirement. And so if you say, as a condition of my workplace or our workplace, you have to wear a mask, and it's, and that's a reasonable request, just like any other reasonable request. If you work in a warehouse and you have to wear steel-toed boots and you don't, that's it.
Yeah, of course. We've got several questions, so let's go through these. If it is testing or vaccination policy, is testing paid for on their own time? So I think what this person is saying,
go ahead,
is if you're requiring testing or a vaccination, is it paid for? Does the company pay for, even if they're doing it on their own time? I would say yes.
Yes. Yeah. So it's the same consideration, basically, as we talked about with vaccination.
Okay.
Both in terms of expense and time spent.
Got it. Okay. And then we have, if you are not vaccinated and you required employee to go get tested every week, do you pay for the time? Does he or she need to stay home until they get results?
So the first part, the answer is the same as we've just discussed.
Right.
And as to the second part, the answer is no, because that would just be completely impractical. Well, right. In some cases it would be, because I don't know the current technology, but sometimes there's instant response and sometimes there's a day's response. But I can tell you, given the short amount of time, the authorities and all the different things would support that.
Okay. So here we have another question. Can employers require the use of N95 masks? If so, for men, do they have to be clean shaven and have the N95 mask fit properly? In other words, follow Cal OSHA guidelines when using the N95 masks?
I could potentially get into all kinds of details on that, but let me say this. First of all, with respect to N95 masks, in a situation where you have people who are not vaccinated, an employer has a duty to provide
The mask.
N95 masks.
Okay.
In terms of the beard, and I'll try to do this as simply as possible, bearded employees have been held to be a category that fits into the category of possible gender discrimination for obvious reasons.
Right.
And so they could potentially say, well, you're causing, you're asking me to shave my beard, and that's discrimination against men, and therefore, I have a claim.
Right.
However, here is different than in other cases where that's been held, and that is the health and safety generally of all of your other employees. I think you could probably defend that claim. And look, again, and let me say this. We were talking before about having a requirement and having, okay, if you have this requirement, you set this requirement, then you can have consequences. But again, they can't be discriminatory. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about potentially discriminatory against men. But you balance the health and safety of other employees against this person's right to have a beard. And my feeling is that at the end of the day, that's going to come out pretty simply on the side of health and safety of other employees.
Health and safety of the majority. Yeah.
I hope that answers the question as completely as is necessary right now anyway.
Yeah, I believe so. We have one more question. This is not related, but what happens if someone in the office, tech or labs, it says biotech companies, test positive? How do you respond to the organization? Are employees required to come back to the office if they feel they were exposed to COVID-19?
That is that's a huge
big
issue
question.
that depends on a lot of different specific
Too many
circumstances.
factors. Too many factors.
If you want to, I'd be happy to answer it for you, or Evelyn would be happy to answer it for you offline.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So we covered this. We talked about physical distancing. So these are simple rules. We agreed. Okay. We have, I think, one more. We have time for this, and we'll have to make it brief because we are coming down to the wire on time. A frequently discussed pandemic-related employment topic is remote work. Are there things employers should consider in connection with any decision to allow it, or how to handle issues arising out of remote work?
Well, here's a couple relatively simple ones. The biggest issue, I think, potential issue that arises out of remote work is when that person is either permanently located in a state, or you allow them to do the work wherever they want to be, and they work out of state, because the general rule is for example, wage and hour laws that you apply in a situation where there's multi-state work or another state work is the laws that apply in the jurisdiction where that work is performed. So you can see how that might cause a problem. And a potential, let's just say you're facing that, a potential solution, and it's becoming or you see it as a complete, almost administrative impossibility. One of the ways you can deal with that is you could say, well, we're going to allow you to remote work, but our requirement is that you perform that work at your residence or within that city or whatever you want to make it. You can make that part of your policy. And therefore, if they stray from that, that's not your problem. You've established that, that's where it's going to be those laws that apply. Another one is potential discrimination, of course, where you allow one person to remote work who's in this category, one person for remote work who's not in that category, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And so those are the things I see as the biggest
Red flags.
issues with respect to remote work. But the key thing is, actually, let me take one more. What do you do in the situation where, and look, this isn't necessarily new in the sense that, let's say you have a salesperson whose territory is New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and their job is to travel around to clients and visit them in these different areas. As a technical matter, when they're driving around or visiting someone in Connecticut, that's one. Same with Rhode Island, same with New York. What I've seen employers do, and what I would advise employers to do when that is just deemed to be an administrative nightmare or impossibility, is if you can determine the state's laws that are most beneficial to the employee, apply those states' laws. The
Right.
little hiccup there is, what about certain technical requirements like wage statements? California says wage statements have to have X, Y, Z, and they do some work in California. So there might be some mixing that you might have to do, but I think you could fairly easily establish what those outliers are with your HR professional or employment attorney.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you, Robert. I think with that, we're down to just a couple of minutes. We want to thank everybody for participating today. We answered this actually. So as I stated, we appreciate everybody's participation. Robert, thank you so much for all the information. We appreciate it. As always, we will be sending everybody a copy of the recording, a copy of the PowerPoint. We hit as many of the pressing topics that we could in the hour provided. And we thank you for your participation. Please do stay and participate in the survey. Thank you so much, and hope that you all have a wonderful day. Again, Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending.